someone to show me how to start it. Thank you.
Peggy, you're the youngest.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to talk about the role of the Ombudsman. I want to give you a bit of a brief overview of what we do, and but particularly to talk about a discussion paper that the Ombudsman released last week titled Investigation into the Rehabilitation and Reintegration of Prisoners in Victoria. Thanks. In setting the scene, I want you to understand that the Ombudsman is a small office. We have 70 staff. Last financial year we dealt with 35,000 approaches, half of which were in our jurisdiction. The other half had come to the wrong place. But again, that's part of our work, is to guide people in the right direction. And of the 17,500 matters that were in our jurisdiction, we investigated in one way or another 3,500, and that included 51 investigations where we used our formal powers, and we have the powers of the Royal Commission, and 12 of those led to reports to Parliament on a whole range of issues that cover the wider public service. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And like Phoebe, I live in Castlemaine. Only on the weekends, because I still have to work. Not for much longer. I've worked for 7 ombudsmen across Australia, including 5 Commonwealth ombudsmen. And I am a practitioner, I am not a bureaucrat. I have done formal investigations into virtually every aspect of the public sector over the years, and perhaps the last major investigation I personally conducted was into the Victorian Chief Commissioner of Police's release of crime statistics, which led to his resignation. So perhaps what I'm saying is I have a practical view of life. And seeing Kaz brought back this wonderful memory of running a 2-day seminar for Ombudsman investigators who deal with prisons matters from around Australia and New Zealand. Kaz was one of the guest speakers, because Kaz has an insight into prison life that not many people in the broader world would understand, and nor did many of the Ombudsman investigators who came along. The 2 senior Ombudsman investigators from New Zealand came, and we had a small social function at the old Melbourne jail. And this is a good reminder to keep things in perspective, because as we were walking around the old Melbourne jail, these 2 gentlemen said, "Hey, this is not a bad prison." And I said, "It's been closed for 50 years. Their prison system is so archaic." So we mustn't forget that we should not simply, like the frog in boiling water, allow things to become so inured to problems. When we reviewed conditions in custody in 2005-2006, at that time we also had jurisdiction over the police, so we did it in conjunction with the Office of Police Integrity, a separate story altogether. And I had a report that the cells at Kyneton Police Station were appalling. They were used every day. I thought, we can hardly make recommendations unless I go and look. Now I should say, ladies and gentlemen, I've been visiting police stations, prisons, juvenile justice detention centres, immigration detention centres, psychiatric hospitals, and anywhere else that people are detained against their will for more than 45 years. And I've never seen such shocking conditions as the Kyneton Police Station. The Chief Commissioner closed the cells the next day. They were dangerous for everyone, including police officers. So we must remember that as we see a change in the prison population, and I'll touch on these in a moment, you will see that we should not accept changes simply because they're forced upon us, that they're forced on the system. For an example, in Victoria, overcrowding. So you'll see from the reports on the board there, the number of formal reports we've made to Parliament in recent years, virtually 1 a year, from conditions in custody to excessive use of force to contraband coming into prison. You've got to look at that one if you've got time. Look on our website. you'll see a photograph of a safe, a secure safe in a prison, and it had a slot where contraband was meant to be put at the end of shifts. It was so full that bits were sticking out. No one had thought about emptying it. That included drugs and weapons and all sorts of things. We looked at prisoner access to healthcare, and again, an area of real concern today, 3 years later. That earlier report in 2011, is there anyone here from the Department of Health? Don't have to put your hand up. That led to the resignation of the director, moving on to greener pastures, and some significant changes, but we are looking at that again. The death of Carl Williams in Barwon Prison, why would we look at that when the homicide squad had charged a man with murder, when the Office of Correctional Services Review had reviewed the conditions there? Well, there were things that we found that no one else found. It was our inquiries that led to the finding of covert listening devices in a number of cells. They weren't being used, but they were there. Why were they there? To conditions about the treatment of prisoners, lax conduct of officers, the fact that the Secretary of the Department of Justice had been warned a year before that Williams was at a real risk of being murdered and no action taken. And more, in fact, a scandalous story of a 16-year-old youth held in Portfield Prison after he played up at the Juvenile Justice Detention Centre. And we found that in the preceding 3 years, 24 children, one as young as 14, because they misbehaved, were transferred to a maximum security prison. So prison work is our work, there's no doubt. But why should we be the only organisation that can independently review conditions in prison? It is because no one else has that independent function. Beautiful, thank you. In 2003, the Department of Justice created the Prisons Inspectorate. When we reviewed conditions in custody, we found that organisation was not only not independent, it was simply not doing its job. It was not reporting publicly. It couldn't conduct proper investigations. It lacked external accountability. Its record keeping was appalling. We recommended that it be abolished and that the function be moved to the Ombudsman, and subsequently the department created the Office of Correctional Services Review. In 3 major reports in the last 2 years, we have found the same problems with the Office of Correctional Services Review. And we have recommended yet again that there be, at the very least, an independent Inspector of Prisons, as there is in WA and New South Wales. The government are currently considering. Those are the 3 reports. Moving on to the next, if I may, thank you. You will see complaints about prisons are increasing significantly. Last financial year they went up 33%, partly because of overcrowding, but partly because the prison system is continuing to fail to address even the most minor complaints. And if you were to ask me what's the greatest success the Ombudsman has had in my time there, the last decade, and I think the simplest thing possible, that prisoners had access to a toll-free call to the Ombudsman that wasn't recorded, that wasn't overheard. Because most prisoners can get access to the phone, it doesn't cost them anything, and most of their complaints are minor. You might even say trivial, but not to them, because it may involve simple things over which they have no control, such as their shoes are missing, their clothes have gone astray, they're not allowed visitors, they've been refused phone calls, and all those things that limit their opportunity to have contact with the wider world. Most of those complaints are dealt with within 48 hours. And 95% of our day-to-day complaints are dealt with within 7 days. But it's a very worrying trend. Our resources aren't going up in proportion. Why aren't there improvements to the system that would then reduce the number of complaints we continue to receive? It's moving on to this paper, and I will leave copies out. If anyone would like to take a copy, I would welcome you doing so, because what we're looking at, we started off doing a further review of the prison system, and we realised that in this current climate it was going to be too big a task. There'd be no point embarking on something that would take us several years to finish, that you lose sight of the project. We try and resolve our investigations within 6 months, where there's a formal investigation, maximum 12. So what we've done is we've simply focused on those areas that relate to rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners. And this is partly why. With the number of prisoners going up, and it will continue to go up, corrections estimate there'll be another 1,000 prisoners in custody in the next 12 months. So we're looking at the broader issues that impact on prisoners. And if you take the time to look at this discussion paper, you'll see some pretty scary statistics. In 2013, 55% of prisoners, as they went into prison, were unemployed or have not been in the workforce. 25% of prisoners were waiting assessment as at early October. That is assessment as to where they should be and what activities they should be involved in. Recidivism, that is repeat offending, is up to 51% of prisoners. 42% of prisoners in 2012-13 had a psychiatric risk rating. 60% had literacy levels that require support, and nearly 60% had numeracy levels that require support. In 2012-13, parole granted fell by 1/3, and parole applications dismissed doubled. So you can see the compounding effect that's happening behind the scenes without real assistance being given to prisoners. Overcrowding continues, which means now we are seeing more violence in prisons, and our recent report earlier this year on conditions relating to harm in custody showed us, and the statistics speak for themselves, that more prisoners are being harmed and more prison officers are being harmed due to overcrowding. Recruiting staff in prisons is getting particularly hard, and particularly so in those areas that require specialist skills. And worse, prisoners are no longer seeking, many are no longer seeking access to rehabilitative programs because it's all too hard. So prisoners on straight release, having served their full sentence without any assistance or rehabilitation, has doubled in the last year. That's approaching 400. And to top it all off, when we look at the data, much of it is simply not available. And Corrections Victoria has not been, in the last few years, been able to provide reliable data to us on the analysis of what's going on. And then to top it all off, and picking up on what I was hearing Phoebe and Anne talk about, is that 22% of male prisoners will be homeless on release. But worse, last year, 44% of women released will be homeless. And it is becoming so critical that one charity is now giving prisoners on release swags because there is nowhere else to house them. So what we're looking at, you'll see in the paper, is the assessment of prisoners, their case management, programs and the availability, and I do think there are some fixes that are available. I do think it's important that across the system there be comprehensive, cohesive programs, not a bit at Loddon and a bit at Fulham and a bit here and a bit there, and better understanding of the justice system so that people will be aware of why this is happening. So we hope that we will be able to, in due course, report to Parliament with some practical and picking up on Peter's comments, achievable outcomes, because Ombudsmen can only recommend, they don't direct. And if I look back over the last 10 years, our success rate is 98% of our recommendations have been accepted in full or in part by successive governments. The other 2% related to matters that are going to cost them a lot of money. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.